May I now request Dr. Neha Arora? She is Assistant Professor of English, Central University of Rajasthan, and the title of her research paper is Fight Against Sexual Colonialism in Meena Kanda Swami's When I Hit You, or a portrait of the writers as a young wife. So, Dr. Neha Arora.
Thank you so much. A very good morning to you all. I just want to quickly share my screen. Uh, okay, is the screen visible?
Yeah, your screen is visible.
Thank you so much. So without much delay, I would directly begin with my presentation. In the morning session, Professor Pathan was talking about rape and the trauma of rape. So in this particular text, I have talked about or focused upon the sexual colonialism of a wife particularly, and hence focusing on uh, marital rape. So quickly, I would just begin. Um, Sexuality is seen as a key. Sorry, let me just. Yeah, sexuality is seen as a key focus of power. The body of a woman becomes an object and target of power. The body that is manipulated, shaped, trained, which obeys and responds. A body that may be subjected, used, transformed, and improved. This is how Foucault discusses the power and the powerful and the powerless, or the hegemonic dominant and the dominated in case of man and woman. Patriarchy translates itself into controlling women physically, emotionally, psychologically, mentally, economically, etc. So, how a woman is conditioned. Actually, there are certain parameters to assess a woman: being chaste, being virgin, and being docile. And I just want to quote Professor Jasbir Jain here, who uh, who says that how women are always projected as, in her words, custodians of culture, preserving it and continuing it through procreation, tradition, rituals, and conservatism. Um, Talking about abuse of women, we have seen that we do get many examples that women have been used to many, but they are absent from history. I'm talking particularly about sexual exploitation of women. Judith Fetterly, in her book The Resisting Reader, a feminist approach to American fiction, refers to women's systematic isolation as man was equated with a human. Similarly, Einstein elucidates on the lack of sexual freedom of women because they are always treated as sexual objects and not as sexual subjects. So she expresses the desperate urge to find ways to combat the commoditization of sexuality which oppresses women. Coming to the issue of marriage, particularly in India, generally girls are groomed only with one aim, that is marriage, and they have to, like, they are trained right from the childhood to preserve their chastity and losing their virginity only in marriage, etc., etc. So marriage becomes an institution to own a woman, and even if the marriage turns out to be abusive, the woman has less chances. I'm not saying that no chances at all, but she has lesser chance to walk out of the abusive marriage for the fear of shaming the family. Then, what is sexual colonialism? I'm just using the word of Iqbal Kaur in the article Protest Against Sexual Colonialism, Kamla Das's My Story. Kaur defines sexual colonialism as the relationship between the sexes, which is a relationship of dominance and subservience. It refers to the relationship between sex and power, and as Kate Millett puts it, I quote, through this system, most ingenious form of interior colonization has been achieved. Uh, Bugo also critiques the widely propagated cultural identification of women as merely the negative object or other to man as a dominating subject. In an abusive marriage, the body of a woman becomes a perpetual colony of man, resulting in her psychophysical colonization. Now, I just want to use the words of Gatoskar and how he defines rape. He says rape is linked with power, that is, the power that men enjoyed in society. Rape brings out and enlarges opposition between the sexes nakedly, unlike other forms of gender based oppression, such as lower wages for women. Rape and the fear of rape, therefore, is an instrument for terrorizing and paralyzing women, contributing to a low sense of self worth. So I'm not just going into the detail of the Indian Penal Code of 375, which lists down that lists down in under what circumstances the sexual intercourse with a woman can qualify as rape. Coming directly to the loopholes of the Indian legal system, uh, the usual social attitude in the Indian society is that there cannot be any lack of consent in marriage. A woman's approval is taken for granted, hence, there arises no question of marital rape. It is the usual implication that in marriage, the man gains complete autonomy over the woman's body. The unconsented sex in an abusive marriage does not qualify to be marital rape, and that's how I define. In fact, I question when does sex in marriage become rape? Is woman's sexuality a thing to be possessed by the husband? Why Indian society is not vocal? I'm not saying it is not at all vocal, but not much vocal about marital rapes. The husband uses penile penetration as a weapon to silence his wife. She's colonized with the use of physical violence. Penis, the symbol of social power, accords superior position to man, whereas the lack of it renders woman dependent, or um, in terms of Sandra Gilbert and Susan Goober, social castration of woman. The strokes of penis, that is patriarchy, choke the voice of vagina, that is woman. So, yes, rape itself is quite traumatic, but I would just focus on the trauma of a wife because in this case, neither the victim nor the society believes, because how can a wife be raped by her own husband? I'm not quoting here Shashi Deshpande, but have lifted the lines from Kandasami's autobiographical work itself. She says, I never understood rape until it happened to me. It was a concept of savagery, of violence, of violation, of disrespect. The man who rapes me is not a stranger who runs away. How do I let another person know how it feels to be raped within a marriage? Sex, actually rape, becomes his weapon to tame me. The shame of rape is the shame of unspeakable. A rape is a fight you did not win. You could not win. A rape is defeat. And she further continues, this male psychosexual logic looks at penetration as punishment. I just love the vocabulary used by Kandasamy. She's actually very bold. This is the rape that disciplines, the rape that penalizes me for the life I had presumably led. This is the rape that taints me, the rape that puts me on the path of being a good wife. This is the rape whose aim is to inspire regret in me. This is the rape whose aim is to make me understand that my husband can do with my body as he pleases. This is rape as ownership. So, I mean, I wonder if sex within marriage is a procreative process, or is it is an act of disciplining and disabling the wife. The lustful and sadist attitude of the husband takes all liberties to tutor and educate his wife, to reprimand her at the trivial misdeeds. So penile penetration actually becomes the act to control female sexuality. So, however, the man attempts to camouflage his illogical logic to justify the systematized nature of rape. So, directly coming to Meena Kandasamy, uh, the lines lifted from her poetry collection, Miss Militancy, she writes, men are afraid of woman who makes poetry dangerous potence, unable to predict when, for what, and for whom she will open her mouth, unable to stitch up her lips, they silence her. So this is how she justifies her writing. and her writings are basically political writing, and because for her personal is political. Her radical feminism argues to resist misogyny, and her fighting words boldly target the circumscribed society. She is known for her blatant attack on patriarchy and caste system. Her fierce language speaks loudly for the subalterns of India. So I just quote from her one of her interviews. She says, "My poetry is naked. My poetry is in tears. My poetry screams in anger. My poetry writs in pain. My poetry smells of blood. My poetry salutes sacrifice. My poetry speaks like my people. My poetry speaks for my people." So this is how she validates her writing, the bold writing. And just a quick like quotation from her from the prologue to Miss Militancy, because this is how I have justified why Kandasamy herself and her protagonist take the flight from patriarchy. She writes, "You are all the men for whom I would never mourn, never mourn. I work to not only get back at you, I actually fight to get back to myself. This tongue allows me to resist rape, to rescue my dreams. My language is not man-made. It is beyond the white, hot rules of your seminal texts. My language is dark and dangerous and desperate in its eagerness to slaughter your myths. I strive to be a sphinx, part woman, part lioness, armed with all the lethal riddles. Come, unriddle me. But be warned, I never falter in a fight."
Dr. Neha.
Yeah, ma'am.
Yeah, please do conclude, ma'am. Yeah.
Okay. So I just want to talk about how in this particular work she has used sex and body as the trope, and because this in this particular work, the husband actually is not committing forcible sex only with her, but is also impairing her growth as an individual, because the protagonist was a writer and he did not allow her to write, and in fact he deactivated all her social site accounts and even coerced her to in sharing her email password. So all these kinds of how the husband tried to circumscribe his wife and treated marriage as a re-education camp. And that's why the protagonist, like the author, took up writing to to vent out her feelings, and she decides to bear her scars. And although she was cautioned by the society not to let her feelings out, but but it did not deter her, and she decides to take the flight to fight back her colonizer. And earlier, penis exerted its power to choke her voice. Later, her pen becomes her weapon to resist her against the hegemonic powers. And writing became for her as a liberating act to reclaim her space, to reclaim her right to write. I'm not just reading. And therefore, she eventually succeeds in decoding her vagina monologues into her writing. And she is no more a creature with female genitalia only. She is her own creator now. That's why writing as a liberating act. So my main thrust of the presentation was we need to talk about sexual freedom, sexual rights of women, also of wives also, and women should have the right to say no to their husband. And this is the last slide, which I would end my presentation with. Just a minute. And this is how I answer that how the protagonist has learned to write back to the master narrative by creating a counter narrative of her own. Okay, I just stopped sharing my screen because, yeah. Yes,
Thank you,
ma'am.
Dr. Neha. We would be taking up all the papers at the end for discussion and
Sure,
for
ma'am, sure.
session. Now, may I invite Dr. Sharma, Associate Professor, MAT, University, Haryana. The presentation is on gender inequality issues in India. Is he here? Dr. Sharma? If not, then Patricia Mary Hodge.
Yes, I'm here. I'm here, ma'am.
Research Scholar, Department of English, Northeastern Hill University, Meghalaya. The
Yes.
title of the presentation is Spirituality and Well-Being, a Post-Secular Context for Feminist Utopia in Select Women's Fiction. So may I now request you to make your presentation, ma'am?
Okay, ma'am. Ma'am, is my screen visible?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. 1 second. Okay, present now. Share window. Okay, now, ma'am.
No, not yet, ma'am. You can click on the present now at the
Ma'am,
bottom.
I have.
Share your entire screen, ma'am.
Okay, ma'am. Let me try one more time. I'm so sorry. Escape. Present now. Share the entire screen. Ma'am, is it working now?
No.
Oh, how come?
Yeah, now it is visible.
No,
Yeah,
it's
it
working.
takes time.
Okay, my slideshow is visible, ma'am.
Yeah, it is visible.
Okay, I'm so sorry for that. Okay,
No.
so I'll just begin.
Yes.
Okay. So as you can see on the screen, the title of my paper is Spirituality and Well-Being, a Post-Secular Context for Feminist Utopia in Select Women's Fiction. And the novels in particular are the ones I'm showing on the screen right now. I first want to point out that with the terms that I'm using, I'm not trying to generalize or universalize anything. I have to make it clear that my setting is particularly a North American Canadian context. And when I speak about religion, I am specifically referring to Judeo-Christianity. So the three authors here, by focusing on spirituality with an involvement with a negotiation with religion, what the authors engage in are, firstly, the problem of female spiritual or religious engagement, the negotiation of spaces for women in religion, from a point of view of feminist Christian theology as well as secular philosophy. And in doing so, they also touch upon the experimentation in post-religious feminist spirituality, hereby linking non-theistic spirituality with non-dominant value systems of power. The authors also look at avenues for the conceptions of utopia that is not monologic or steadfast, but instead diverse in its capacities of change. The authors are not focusing on monopolizing the feminine within religion. Instead, they do not limit female spirituality to being reactionary to patriarchal religion. They instead assert that women's spirituality needs to be recognized as autonomous and personal. So it is in this autonomous and personal context where well-being, which is a secular concept, comes into the realm of spirituality. Now, Alexis M. Smith and Margaret Atwood make room for religious and spiritual discourses in their novels by questioning if the mere creation of spaces for women in organized religion can truly empower them. Butler, in her two novels, looks at the new possibilities for well-being and justice in post-religious syncretism that is eclectic, feminist, humanist, and scientific. So in their own individual ways, they reflect the blending of the disparate ontologies of secular spiritualisms, Western feminist spirituality and its movements like witchcraft, Wiccanism, indigenous religious traditions, eco-spirituality, transcendentalism, along with critical negotiations with more fixed ontologies like monotheism. So when I say spirituality as a term here, this is not equivocal to the religiosity of major contemporary established religions. It does not require strict religious affiliation. At the same time, I am not referring to a purely secular spirituality or atheist spirituality or non-theistic spirituality, which is an oxymoronic existence prevalent in the contemporary Western well-being and New Age spirituality movement. So I'm not considering it as simply a dimension of cultural diversity. nor should it be interpreted in the modern secular context as retaliation or a complete alternative to religion. Spirituality instead here rejects the isms, the infallible isms of authoritarian Christianity, does not reject religion completely. Instead, there is a post-secular synthesis of traditional religion and secular spirituality through post-religious secular practices that embed spirituality in secular areas, for example, environmentalism. So spirituality is dependent on the patriarchal structure because it rejects it, but at the same time borrows eclectic rituals and beliefs from various religions and theologies. So religion is recognized as providing identity and comfort, and the second wave secular feminist tendency to view religion as completely against the liberation of women can sometimes ignore the cultural contributions that religions can provide. So what the authors instead do is use the emphasis on self, personal growth, solidarity with others, and nature, which are elements of secular spirituality, as positive tools to negotiate the confined spaces for women in structured, institutionalized religion. So this post-secular dimension of spirituality asserts that the culture of women's spirituality is another aspect of the feminist consciousness and empowerment, which is made apparent in healing, nourishing, solidarity, and earth care. So spirituality is a site for solidarity and affirmative femininity, as we see the characters in the novel consciously engage in oppositional resistance in two areas, that is the maligning of the feminine in the sacred in religion, as well as retrograde essentialism in feminism, which has resisted women's attempts to re-signify themselves with the sacred. So this personal empowerment in the spiritual from a feminist perspective contains political potential. Though coexistence of both traditional religion and secularism has thus allowed for a rise of a post-secular spirituality, where spirituality is now embedded in the secular context, where the religious did not exist before. And it is in this post-secular context where well-being comes into play. You can see on the screen here. So when I speak of well-being, I'm referring to post-secular Western religious practices which are concerned with well-being through food, through clothing, through medicine, through meditation, etc., that we see in movements such as holistic healing or women's circle. So all these movements embody forms of spirituality which used to be once upon a time monopolized by traditional religious practices. For example, meditation. So in these post-religious secular practices, spirituality is now embodied in personal experiences which can be therapeutic and leisurely. So spirituality in areas that are non-religious or secular. In the novels, an example of this I can provide is gardening. So the care of the self through secular or non-theistic spirituality can be equated with the construction of the self, personal and subjective choice of freedom, positive relationships, and social responsibility. So the personal has political potential if we look at it through spirituality. So in the novels in particular, these rituals and practices are not owned by any particular religion, nor are they prescribed with a dogmatic set of rules. They're enacted and performed by the self, adapting and reformulating spiritual ideas as needed, not as dictated. This comes intuitively to the women, as their consciousness and their ways of experiencing reality is not hampered by the logical, rational understanding of reality. Now, in all of this, the authors also engage in the creation of new political and social states of consciousness to create utopian visions which challenge conscious experience. And this is done through the women's own personal subjective spiritualities. Dana Fancourt specifically points out the use of altered states of consciousness as sites to synthesize the fantastic, the spiritual, and the political in the realm of utopian possibilities in feminist utopian fiction. So in these states of consciousness, we notice the articulation of utopian moments through dreams, trances, meditations, and hallucinations, which are intrinsically related to the text vision of feminist utopianism, which is rooted in creating new spiritual and political consciousness. So the authors, we can see the recognition of attempts towards the creation of spiritual consciousness, which becomes a space of freedom for women to escape from the rigidity of the conventions of religion, knowledge, and traditional utopian conceptualizations. So the authors negotiate the existence of other realities, mental and spiritual, which have erstwhile been rejected in the dualistic modes of conceptualizing reality. And they negotiate this with the consciousness and inner reality of their characters. So these altered states of consciousness are adequately achieved when the women are removed from modern reality and its secular rational assumptions about truth and existence. So the utopian effort, by treating the earth as a living organism and spirituality as a personal political ethic of responsibility, emphasizes on the spiritual as well as the corporal. So these utopias are not monologic in construction. They are not steadfast, unchanging, or based upon one fixed set of ideas. Instead, this dialogic construction of utopia through spirituality allows for diversity and the possibility for positive change. So all in all, the novels narrate tales of spiritual transformation in safe physical and mental spaces, which then progress to self-justification of women's mental spaces and the affirmation of the female body. So with that, I'll just conclude my presentation. Okay. No. Stop sharing.
Yeah, we have now the next presenter, Dr. Ritushri Sen Gupta. Ritushri.
Yes,
Yeah.
ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes, she is assistant professor, Department of English, Patra Sayyar Mahavidyalaya, Bankura, West Bengal. And the title of her presentation is Chitrangada, a mirror to Tagore's androgynous aesthetics. That's the title of her presentation. So now Dr. Ritushri Sen Gupta. Yes.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for kindly introducing me to everybody here, and a very good morning to all of you. The title of my paper, as ma'am said, is Chitrangada, a mirror to Tagore's androgynous aesthetics. Is based on or focused on the very, very famous dance drama that Tagore had composed, and is also one of the most poignant mythical adaptation of Mahabharata as taken up by Tagore. Chitrangada, it's for the information of all, was one of the wives of Arjuna. However, we don't see much of her in Mahabharata. However, in Tagore's rendition of the character and the text, we see her in a different light, in a different picture, other than that was usually assigned to a wife of a great warrior. She is not the second here, but the first and the prime protagonist or the prima donna, as suggested by Tagore in his play. So I'll get back to my paper. The plethora of Tagore's writings, which often blurs the distinction of genres and themes, comment on the prevalent communication that continues within the psyche of the author. A spokesperson of 19th century Bengal, the responsibility of handling the social responses, of course, to literature, had been magnificently cradled and championed by Tagore. A biographical reading by Krishna Kripalani, the name of the book is Tagore, A Myriad-Minded Man, we do confront with an image of a quasi-patriarch, benevolent, nevertheless a figure of patriarchal authority. Now, Tagore has many a times been charged with the comment that he married his daughters pretty early, sometimes even sort of goaded them into marriages. So was he a feminist supporter after all? The dichotomy remains in modern criticisms and critiques of Tagore. That why would he do that? However, biographical accounts often fail to recognize and righteously takes into account that kaleidoscopic pluralities or micronarratives that do exist within the meta-narrative of a larger-than-life image of an universal poet. The poets or the author Tagore or the man who establishes private hostels for girls in an ashram and establishes a a stage for the performance of both men and women students, how would he be so different in his personal life? The question remains a very, very pertinent one. To understand Tagore's treatment of the female or feminine, one can possibly look at them from two approaches. One, the characters, which can be, again, when we are reading a character of Tagore, we can take into account certain subdivisions, such as setting of the character, where the character is from, his or her financial or economic position, social status. All these things can be taken into account. Then the history of the character. Number three, transition, if any, of the protagonist and the other round or straight characters. I would like to briefly talk about the novel Chokher Bali, or Sand in the Eyes. That's a very, very important novel of Tagore, where the reconciliation happens at the end of an extramarital affair that is taken, that involves three people. The married couple reconciles, and the other widow lover goes to Kashi. That is a very convenient alternative for death. However, the predecessor of Tagore, Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, who had been the author of Rajmohan's Wife, in his most of the novels, such as Kapal Kundala or Bishobrikho or Krishna Kanter Will, these were the novels where invariably the woman, the other woman who's not within the frame or the paradigms of the domestic world, dies, either commits suicide or goes away or just dies by, his favorite disease was tuberculosis. He would always kill the other woman in either by using either of these tropes. Tagore doesn't do that. Tagore sends his novel characters, or the characters that he constructs in the novels, to Kashi or to her own house, or even settles for a widow remarriage, but does not allow any kind of extramarital sexual freedom that is experienced by women. However, he does not for once say that these extramarital relations or any kind of sexual discovery of the women were only done at the cost of the women's freedom. He would always imply, in a very subtle and nuanced manner, that not just the women, there were other people to be taken into account, not just the men as well, the society at large. The 19th century conservative 19th century conservative Renaissance Bengali society, because 19th century is called the Renaissance of Bengal. Okay, so there is a common trait where Tagore very, very pertinently comments that how with the rise of nationalism, the idea or appropriation of women also underwent a lot of change. However, the similar kind of female liberation, as explored by Satyajit Ray and even Rituparna Ghosh from Tagore's texts, such as texts like Shamapti or The End or Postmaster, here we see that Tagore really appreciates the very image of tomboy. Now, tomboy again is used as a derogatory term in certain ways, but Tagore, according to Tagore, the reading is like, if somebody looks like a tomboy, that doesn't mean that her gender performance is compromised. If a girl is not feminine, that doesn't strip her of her femininity or her female. What remains underexplored is that Tagore did not stop at giving voice to the female causes or feminine appropriations, but understood, of course, in his own way. He did marry his daughters off at an considerably early age, but made sure that all of them were educated very well. Also made sure that they were financially secured. He did not just give up on them. It is possible to read in the works of Tagore a latent androgynous voice, a concept that was critically explored by Virginia Woolf in A Room of One's Own. Woolf says, I quote, "In each of us, two powers preside, one male, one female. The androgynous mind is resonant and pores, naturally creative, incandescent, and undivided. In modern variations of psychological studies, it has been proved by the cognitive scientists that psychological androgyny is essential to creativity. However, there is something very interesting about it. We don't get to see that. And there is no verified or constructive test to find out how psychologically androgynous a person is. However, as Joseph Meeker says, that we are human beings are the only literary creatures on earth. They do have a responsibility towards making the environment around them better. However, if there is no gender equality, or there is no even description or even space for all the genders, not just male female, we have transgenders and queers also amongst us. It is very, very important that the mind of a writer gives vent to that. And there are other reasons too, which I want to talk about. Number one is it allows the individual enough space for self-acceptance and adaptation of the other. If you can accept yourself with all your difficulties and all your misgivings, misappropriations, you can be equally lenient, or at least a little lenient to the other. Number two, it gives chance to negate or at least ignore dichotomies of gender and appreciate gender plurality. Just because that person is gay, that doesn't make him a bad person. Number three, it emancipates oneself from gender construct or gender identities as well as gender roles. Feminists such as Judith Butler has asserted that gender is a performance. In Chitrangada, which is a dance drama, Tagore plays upon the idea of blurring the dichotomy between the masculine and feminine. The plot begins with the narrator asserting the prophecy that was made in the royal household of Manipur, that the household will only have male children or male heirs. However, when Chitrangada was born in the household, her father, the monarch of Manipur, raised her as a son. However, an infant, if we, from a Lacanian point of view, we know that an infant at a zero age does not understand, because the stages of sexual development does not occur at the zero age. So, one thing also has to be remembered, that the monarch of Manipur did not have any other heir, and Manipur, like many other select tribes of Northeast, did for a time being support.
Dr. Ritushri, would
Yes,
you please
ma'am.
conclude? Yeah, would you please conclude?
Yeah, sure. So in Chitrangada, what we see is that there is a crowning wish where Chitrangada transforms from a masculine figure as wanted by her father to a feminine body in the search of love, but again transforms into a masculine monarch figure to assert her own dignity and position in the trope of monarchy. So I conclude by saying that Tagore was one of the premier premier supporters of the crowning wish that comes with gender plurality, giving the individual the space for their own identity as deserved by them. Thank you.
So now may I request Gaurav Kumar. Gaurav Kumar.
Am I audible, ma'am?
Yeah. Gaurav Kumar, he is from University of Lucknow, Uttar Pradesh, India. The title of his presentation is Gendering the Madness, Understanding Mental Health of Indian Housewives in the Light of Am and the Big Home. So, Gaurav Kumar now. Gaurav, you can start your presentation.
Okay, ma'am. Ma'am, my screen visible?
Yes, the screen is visible.
Okay, ma'am. So the title of my presentation is Gendering the Madness, Understanding Mental Health of Indian Housewives in the Light of M and the Big Home. First, we will understand what is mental health. Mental health includes our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. It affects how we think, feel, and act. It also helps us determine how we handle stress, relate to others, and make choices. Mental health is important at every stage of life, from childhood and adolescence through adulthood. Mental health is major concern worldwide, and India is not far behind in sharing this. If we evaluate development in the field of mental health, the pace appears to be slow. Dr. Brock, the first Director General of WHO, said that without mental health, there can be no true physical health. It's been ages since he said that but still, about 14% of the global burden of disease is attributed to neuropsychiatric disorders. Now we will look at the novel first. The novel M and the Big Who is an autobiographical novel by Jerry Pinto. The story of the son's account of life with a mentally unstable mother. Imelda Mendes is called M by her two children. One is the unnamed narrator, and another is his sister Suzanne. Their father's name is Augustine, who is called the Big Home, and they all live together in a 1 BHK flat in Mahim. The book tells us M's story through her letters, sharp comments, and interconnected memories. It tells us the stories of M's madness, her deep dark depression, and her fearful, excited manias. In India, the condition of mental health is worse, the major factor being the health services and the way society sees the mentally ill person. In the novel, we can see the narrator criticizing this. I quote, on a college trip to the Thane mental hospital, I had seen what I thought was the worst of the India mental health care system. Unquote. On another instance, he reflects, I quote, the mad in India are not the mentally ill. They are simply mad. They have no other identity. Here everyone was mad. Unquote. We can see the author is trying to address both issues of mental health in India, healthcare facilities, and the stigma. Both, though both men and women get affected by mental health issues, but the condition of women in India is more at risk. Gender has been described as a critical determinant of mental health and mental illness. Women in India suffer from domestic workload and domestic violence, gender-based role stressors, and negative life experiences and events led to these types of mental illness in the housewife in India. This lead to common mental disorders like depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, insomnia, and in case of domestic violence, post-traumatic stress disorder. Most Mostly these abnormalities are ignored or left untreated, which led to suicide. The primary reason being India is still patriarchal at its core. The role of women are pre-decided by men. They do as the men narrates them to. In the novel, the author discusses the idea, I quote, patriarchy's claim on body of women and how men always wanted to control the way women reproduce, unquote. These kind of restrictions bring tension and negative life experience in the life of a woman's life, which lead to mental illness in them. The other reason for suffering in patriarchal society can be a joint family system, submissive status of daughter-in-law at home, preference for the male child, the practice of dowry, lower education status of women, strict conduct for the female, primary role for women being childbearing and lastly, subjected to domestic violence. In the novel, M is suffering from bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder is a mental health condition that causes extreme mood swings that include emotional highs and lows. Many episodes may include symptoms such as high energy, reduced need for sleep, and loss of touch with reality. While reading the text, I realized that responsibility of motherhood and delivering these responsibility led to breakdown of M. M has always been an energetic woman, but at some point after her children were born, a deep-rooted depression set in. Childbearing is a unique biopsychosocial occurrence that profoundly affects a woman's physically, socially, and emotionally. The woman's transition to motherhood has implication for all her relationship and for her societal role. M described the beginning of her lifelong struggle with the bipolar disorder, beginning with the birth of his first child. The author skillfully delineates how clinical depression differs from the sadness. As I quote, after you were born, someone turned on a tap. At first, it was only a drip, a black drip, and I felt sadness. And I felt sadness. I knew that it was like, but I didn't know what it would become. I lived with it for weeks, unquote. Her manic episodes are scorching, larger-than-life affair, described vividly, visually using the endless cup of teas, chain smoking, and eventually moving on to sleepless night for her and her family. With the birth of second child, she also started having delusions and hallucinations, and recounted one such incident about the day she take her second born child away from the home into the clutches of a particular esteemed man because, I quote, the fan or the people from the fan ordered her to take her son and leave the house. Not all their orders were ominous. Analyzing this, one can say that childbearing is a challenging biological and socio and psychosocial event. It confers an elevated risk for psychiatric episodes. The strongest predictor of mental illness during the prenatal period is history of previous psychiatric illness. In the case of she has a history of mental illness in childhood, which was not treated, and this led to her bipolar disorder from only depression during her perinatal period. Country like India has seen a major rise in suicide cases in recent years. According to WHO, the suicide rate in India in 2015 was 15.7%, which is higher than the regional average of 12.9% and the global average of 10.6%. Girls from nuclear families and women married at very young age are at a higher risk for attempted suicide and self-harm. Data shows that women outnumber men in completed suicide in India. In the novel, M tries to commit suicide. In fact, she tries to commit suicide 3 times, as the narrator remembers. I quote, that one was attempt number 3, at least, very least, unquote. Until recently, attempted suicide was a crime in India under the Indian Penal Code Section 309. And in the novel, the family knows that. As the narrator says, I quote, suicide was a crime, the only where you could be punished for failing. Therefore, the family tries to take care of M in the best possible ways. Suicide prevention. It is important for us to understand that mental illness is a medical condition and it can be cured through medicine, therapy, and most importantly, love. With the novel, M talks about there being no drain for the sadness and deadly she was so afraid that she thought she would drown herself and her children as well. Therefore, she decided it was better for her to jump in front of a bus and goes out quickly like a bang. These kind of thoughts are natural in bipolar condition. Both children of M and his husband are doing everything to save M from drowning in her depression. The narrator and the Susan constantly talks to M and keep her engaged. As the narrator says, I quote, I tried to believe M in everything she said. It was my act of faith because I could see how the outside world immediately discounted whatever she said. Unquote. This act of faith worked its way through the narrator's description of his mother. As the narrator resists labels and judgment about M's parenting, avoid blames and victimization, and insist on drawing attention to her. In India, we can stop suicide if we give a little extra care to the people who need it. The Indian housewives generally keeps themselves busy with work and parenting. This monotonous routine is only the reason for their declining mental health. The family needs to understand this and help these housewives in every possible way to lessen their burden. Even if there is a illness, Indian society needs to accept it and provide proper counseling and love. I want to end this presentation with a quote from the novel, which every man needs to follow. I quote, that is why Indian women fall ill, M said, so that their husband will hold their hands. Thank you.
Yes. So now we have the 4 paper presenters who have presented their research paper. the first paper. Meanwhile, if you have the questions, audience, you can put it into the chat box. You can drop in the chat box and we can take up them one by one. So Dr. Neha Arora, she focused on politics of body, objectification of women. She also mentioned about Foucault, the power and the other, how women is being seen as the other. Then the abuses that are being caused to women. Women are being considered as sexual objects. She also talked about the idea of marriage. She referred to Kamala Das, My Story, Kate Millett and Simone de Beauvoir. She also talked about Simone de Beauvoir, the negative image of a woman as the other. Then she also talked about the rape as a gender-based oppression, loopholes in Indian marital rape and colonization. That was the major focus. A trauma of a wife, especially referring to Kandaswamy, When I Hit You. And she also mentioned about the personalist political psychosexual reflections in writing as a liberating act, that she talked about like reflections in writing as a liberating act. And she also talked about psychosexual in the novel. Then the next paper presenter, Patricia Mary Hodge, she has dealt with spirituality and well-being, both in the context as from Judeo-Christianity. Her focus was, she talked to a great extent about spirituality, post-secular synthesis, embedding spirituality in secular areas, and citing the examples of Alexis M. Smith, Marrow Island, Margaret Atwood, and Octavia Butler. And also mention about embedding spirituality in secular areas, how spirituality in the context of self-development, self-actualization, and well-being of all human beings in the was the major focus, and especially women's spirituality, how it could be developed. That was been the highlights of her paper. Then Dr. Ritu Shri Sen Gupta, because Dr. Sharma was absent, and we had Dr. Ritu Shri Sen Gupta as the next presenter. So the Ritu she talked about dance drama. Tagore has composed Chitraganda, wife of Arjuna's Mahabharata, that has been depicted, and it was in a different light, different picture altogether that has been projected as the protagonist in Tagore's Chitraganda. Then Kazi Petrarchy, feminist biography account. Then she also mentioned to some extent about the poet himself, the private ashram, the stage performance, male and female, both, how they were being given space on the stage, the character of Tagore, the settings, like the social, economic, and various other settings, status of the protagonist, and the other domestic world that died. Tagore also sent his character to Kashi, that was been mentioned. He doesn't allow extramarital relations. Then also talked about the 19th century Renaissance society and how due to the rise of nationalism, it changed the women representations. Virginia Woolf and talked about the androgyne, male, female, that's dressed in every being. So that was the few important aspects that have been covered up by Ritu Shri Sen Gupta. Then moving further with Gaurav Kumar, he tried to look at mental health psychologically, and also mention about the WHO mental health. Then Jerry Pinto's Am and the Big Home, unnamed narrator, mental health is worse, mental illness in women, reasons for mental health, the bipolar disorder, and various other aspects that have been referred by Gaurav Kumar. Let me also mention about the suicide rate. From age 13 onwards, the rise has been 60% at the international level. And especially it has been mentioned that most of the adults, they go for suicide. So what would be the measures that could be taken to prevent suicide cases, not only in the Indian context, but at the international level. So these were the papers that were being presented by different presenters. I congratulate each one of you for taking all the efforts and pains and writing research articles on these topics. So these topic of your paper presenting are being open for discussion. If you have a piece of information to pass, if you have any questions, anything to share, please feel free and you can question the presenters. The forum is open for discussion. Any questions?
So it seems like, ma'am, there is no question. So I again thank you, Dr. Mehrunnisa Pathan, for chairing this session. So it was again very nice, ma'am, having you once again, and thank you so much.